My name is Mabel and I am 42 years old. Every engine tells a truth if you listen to the knock. You will never manage the books without a family member watching, she said. I spent 12 years believing her. The old metal filing cabinet sat in the corner of the office. It collected dust and useless receipts while the actual profits vanished into pockets that did not belong in a garage. Eunice stood by the workbench with her clipboard. You are just too trusting for the business side of things, she said. I wiped the grease from my hands onto a greasy rag. The invoices piled up on the counter every single week. I trusted the system we had built together over the long haul of operating a local mechanic shop. The numbers on the page never matched the cash in the drawer. Arlo walked past the open bay doors with a slow nod. You work too hard for too little recognition around here, he said. I did not answer H. Do me one kindness and subscribe before we go on. Everything turns on what I kept inside that filing cabinet, and you will want to be here when it finally opens. I am not going to raise my voice once in this. It is a slow reckoning, not a fight staged in front of an audience. And drop a comment below, if you would, telling me what town or country you are listening from Taunig. I spent my mornings on the concrete floor of the shop in Muncie. Every machine left a paper trail behind it. A repair ticket recorded every worn gasket and loose bolt with unsparing clarity. You learn to read the signs before the metal failed completely. A slight vibration in the steering column meant a warped rotor. A low hum in the transmission housing pointed straight to a bearing on its last leg. The logic of mechanics was simple and unforgiving. You opened the logbook and tracked the symptoms back to their source. Nothing stayed hidden for long if you knew where to look for the wear. I trusted that order implicitly. The shop ran on grease, coffee, and the quiet rhythm of diagnostics. Eunice had her own office across town, handling the books while I stayed under the hoods. I assumed our separate duties balanced each other out cleanly. The ledger was just another form of diagnostic chart. I never thought to check if the numbers recorded there were TR. The Miller family operated under a specific code that nobody ever wrote down on paper. In the Miller household, what was earned through grease and late hours belonged by public decree. It went to the sibling who stood at the register and called it charity. That was the unwritten rule we all grew up knowing by heart. Eunice recited versions of it whenever money changed hands between us. She had a way of making theft sound like a generous contribution. Arlo sat on a wooden crate near the garage doors and watched me wipe down a greasy socket set. He had lived down the street for decades and understood how the family mechanics worked. Everyone knew how Eunice operated. She took the receipts and left the heavy lifting for my shop floor. Arlo shook his head slowly while looking at the dirty floorboards. They expect you to just hand it over because of how you were raised, he said. I kept my hands moving across the metal tools. The tradition ran deep in our bloodline. If you worked with your hands, you were merely a laborer providing raw materials for the administrative mind. That was the family law drilled into us during every holiday dinner. Eunice held the ledger like a sacred text that excused her from physical labor. She believed her desk work justified taking whatever she wanted from the drawer. The routine felt entirely normal to everyone else in town. The local hardware store owner nodded along whenever Eunice explained her bookkeeping methods to him. People assumed my older sister carried the heavy burden of keeping the garage solvent. They saw a woman with a neat leather binder and assumed honesty lived inside the pages. They never looked at the oil stains on my work shirts. My father left behind old tools and a garage lease when he passed away. Eunice treated that inheritance as her personal bank account from the very beginning. She managed the bank deposits while I handled the broken transmissions and rusted axles. The division of labor seemed fair during our early years in business together. I trusted her entirely with the paperwork side of things. Trust is a heavy anchor when the chain starts to rust away link by link. I spent my days diagnosing engine knocks and replacing worn gaskets. Eunice spent her hours translating those repairs into vanished currency. The disparity grew wider with each passing month without anyone else noticing the shift. The family philosophy shielded her from any real scrutiny by outsiders. Arlo spat onto the concrete and reached for a clean rag. Your sister has a very persuasive way of explaining things, he said. I nodded and tossed a broken spark plug into the metal bin. The sound echoed loudly through the quiet repair bay. I knew the coming humiliation would feel completely natural to them. They expected me to smile while my hard work vanished into her pocket. Nobody questioned the way the money moved from my register to her private account. The local community believed in the hierarchy of brains over brawn. Eunice made sure everyone understood her vital role in keeping the doors open. I was just the mechanic who turned wrenches in the back. The arrangement suited their view of how the world was supposed to function for people like. The workplace door opened wide with a brittle creak. Eunice stepped inside the room. She was 45 years old and carried a leather portfolio under her arm. Her coat smelled of cold rain and expensive wool. She placed the dark portfolio upon the edge of the timber desk. Arlo stood near the doorway. He was 68 years old, with grease-stained knuckles and a faded cap pulled low over his forehead. A blue industrial towel served to dry his palms. He had worked these greasy bays for decades. He looked tired today. His shoulders slumped slightly under his canvas jacket as he watched her enter. Certain individuals simply lack commercial aptitude, Mabel, yet I have consistently been happy to assist, Eunice remarked while keeping her eyes fixed on the documents. Her voice carried that smooth, practiced tone. It was the exact tone she used whenever our father was listening from the back room. She adjusted her silver rings deliberately. She picked up a blue pen from the plastic tray on the desk. I am managing the daily receipts just fine, I said. Arlo shifted his weight on the concrete floor. He did not say anything to defend me against her remarks. He never did when Eunice was in the room. He just looked down at his oil-stained boots. He cleared his throat and stepped back toward the hydraulic lift. His loyalty was quiet and entirely useless when it mattered most to me. Behind Eunice stood the heavy metal filing cabinet against the back wall. It was painted institutional green. The bottom drawer always stuck if you pulled it too fast. Held to its side by a chipped magnet was a faded child's drawing of a red truck with crooked wheels. I drew that picture when I was 7 years old. It had survived 3 decades of shop dust and engine smoke right here in Muncie. Eunice flipped open the ledger. She tapped a sharp fingernail against the paper margin. You missed a column on yesterday's log, she said. I looked at the open page. The numbers were entirely correct. Every single entry matched the physical repair tickets hanging on the metal wall outside. But Eunice liked to find imaginary errors in my work. It made her feel like the absolute supervisor she always pretended to be. It is right there, I said, pointing straight to the line. She sighed softly. It was the sound of infinite patience worn thin by my supposed inadequacy. That was the performance she offered everyone who walked through the front office doors. We need to review the quarterly taxes tomorrow, Eunice said. Arlo paused by the parts counter. He pretended to examine a worn spark plug. A slight quiver shook his hands as they pressed the dense steel. He knew how the shop actually ran. He watched the cash drawer every single day of the week. Yet he kept his mouth shut. He needed his weekly paycheck too badly to risk an argument with the front office. You take care of the taxes, I said. She nodded once, a crisp, satisfied motion. She believed she had already won every argument before it even started. I watched her turn back to the desk. The green metal of the filing cabinet caught the harsh fluorescent glare overhead. The old crayon drawing stayed pinned firmly to the side. A small piece of my childhood trapped in a room run by someone who kept score in pencil. Arlo shuffled toward the service bay. His thick footwear dragged across the cement ground. The silence between us felt remarkably heavy. I stayed by the workbench and watched the second hand tick around the white clock face. The afternoon dragged on with slow steps. Eunice continued writing in her book. She did not look up again. I closed my own logbook and walked out toward the empty bar. The office smelled of hot brake fluid and old paper. Eunice sat behind the wooden desk. She opened the green binder with slow precision. Her silver rings clicked against the cardboard cover. I stood near the door with my dirty rag. The daily repair ticket sat on the counter. Every rattle has a cause, and the cause is always cheaper to face early, she announced. Her voice carried across the small room. I watched her pen move across the ruled lines. She turned a page without looking up at me. The silence stretched between us for several long seconds. You missed a column on this page, she said. I stepped closer to the desk. The ink looked dark and permanent. I checked the figures twice in my head. Those numbers matched every invoice from the morning shift. She shook her head with quiet disappointment. Her expression remained entirely blank and professional. The afternoon sun cut through the dirty window glass. Dust motes danced in the pale yellow light. This ledger requires absolute precision, she said. I looked down at the open book. My boots stayed planted on the concrete floor. Arlo remained silent by the far window. He did not turn his head to watch us. The family rule hung over the room like smoke. What was earned through grease belonged somewhere else entirely. My hands felt heavy inside my pockets. I kept my eyes on the bottom margin. I handled the heavy transmissions all morning. My shoulders ached from the physical labor. She managed the administrative side from afar. The discrepancy in the totals troubled me deeply. I pointed my finger at the disputed entry. That total matches the parts delivery, I said. She simply sighed and shook her head again. Her fingers smoothed the paper edge. The ledger closed with a dull thud against the wood. The balance must reflect reality, she insisted. I stood there without raising my voice. Shouting never fixed a broken valve in the shop. You have always struggled with basic bookkeeping, she added. Her words landed softly in the quiet room. No one came to my defense against the desk. Arlo stared outside at the empty gravel lot. The institutional green filing cabinet stood behind her chair. A child drawing of a red truck hung on the metal. I felt the sharp weight of the moment. Nothing I said would change her written record. The numbers on the page belonged to her story now. I wiped my palms on my worn work pants. The shop outside hummed with quiet mechanical potential. Every machine needed proper alignment to run straight. Human arrangements proved much harder to adjust once crooked. She reached for her black coffee cup with care. I walked back toward the garage floor without speaking. The heavy door separated us once aga. The shift happened without an argument. Nobody raised a hand. The workbench remained dusty under the hanging lamp. I cleared my personal sockets off the tray. A socket set belonged in a private drawer anyway. Arlo glanced over from his brake lathe but kept his mouth shut. He understood the weather in that room. Eunice stayed across town. I brought a cardboard box from the back storage room. I placed my personal torque wrench inside the cardboard box, while the radio played a low static country tune from Indianapolis. Then I moved toward the corner. The institutional green filing cabinet stood beside the metal desk. It had a chipped magnet holding a faded picture. I cleared out the bottom drawer completely. That drawer became my new holding space. I started keeping my independent mileage logs inside it. Every service note went straight into that metal drawer. Nobody else used those folders. I slid the steel drawer shut with a soft click. My morning routine changed its shape. I brewed coffee in a chipped ceramic mug instead of the shop pot. I walked the perimeter of the garage before unlocking the front door. The concrete surface was noticeably chillier than normal beneath my thick footwear. A loose belt squealed on a Ford alternator near the alignment rack. I tightened the tensioner bolt without calling out to Arlo. He nodded once from the shadows near the parts washer. We kept our distance. Work filled the hours cleanly. Customers brought their sedans and pickups for standard brake jobs. I wrote every repair ticket with precise detail. The liquid hardened at a sluggish pace beneath the ceiling's fluorescent lamps. I filed the duplicate receipts in my green cabinet instead of the main ledger. Eunice expected me to manage the grease while she handled the numbers. I stopped caring about the balance discrepancy in her ledger book. Let the numbers drift where they wanted. I had my own records now, hidden behind a heavy steel latch. Lunch arrived at noon in a brown paper bag. I ate a cold turkey sandwich sitting on an upturned grease pail. The garage door stayed half open to let the autumn wind blow through. A blue sedan idled in the second bay waiting for new brake pads. I rose to my feet and cleaned my palms using a shop rag. There was no bitterness in my chest, just a cold, hollow space. I walked over to the cabinet and placed my pen inside the top drawer. I was entirely alone in the SH. Let me put a question to you. Has someone ever mistaken your calm for weakness and helped themselves to what was yours because they were sure you would never say a word? That was my whole life for a while. If it was yours too, leave a comment. I mean it, hearing where you have been makes carrying this story forward feel less lone. The calendar on the garage wall turned another page without ceremony. Winter frost coated the lower panes of glass near the workbench. The bitter winter air settled heavily over the cold concrete floor while I pressed another yellow carbon copy firmly into place. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the institutional green filing cabinet. Inside sat 3 manila folders labeled by month. Each folder held precise records of every vehicle that entered the repair bay. Months blurred into 2 full years of steady labor. I tightened brake lines and replaced worn transmissions with calloused hands. Eunice stayed across the room at her wooden desk with her black coffee and silver rings. She maintained her green ledger every single morning without fail. I never interrupted her administrative routine, and she never asked about my independent notes. We operated in total silence like two strangers sharing a narrow hallway. Arlo shuffled past my workstation around 10 o'clock carrying a dirty oil pan. He glanced sideways at the green cabinet before looking down at his worn canvas boots. He kept his mouth shut to protect his weekly paycheck from unnecessary trouble. I understood his quiet hesitation and nodded once without speaking a word. Everyone in this building learned early how to mind their own business. More paperwork accumulated inside the metal drawer during the following autumn season. I slipped 24 separate parts invoices into the second folder behind a cardboard divider. Every single paper matched the exact date of delivery and the actual vendor signature. Nothing was left to chance or faulty memory in my systematic arrangement. The physical proof grew thicker week by week, while the cash drawer discrepancy quietly persisted up front. Rain drummed against the corrugated tin roof through the long afternoon hours. I wiped grease from my knuckles using a stiff blue shop rag and closed the drawer. The metal glided smoothly on its steel tracks without making a single sound. I picked up my chipped ceramic mug and walked back toward the lift. Another vehicle waited with a slipping clutch that needed immediate attention. Spring arrived, bringing fresh layers of dust through the open garage doors. I spent 3 full days rebuilding a heavy diesel engine for a local delivery truck. My fingers worked automatically through the familiar sequence of bolts and gaskets. The work provided a steady anchor, while the background noise of the front office continued unchanged. Eunice balanced her columns, while I recorded every single replacement part on my own docket. Another 45 service tickets joined the growing stack inside the metal enclosure. I organized them by date and supplier name with absolute mechanical precision. The system required no supervision and cost nothing to maintain beyond simple discipline. I closed the drawer and locked it with a small brass key. The brass key felt cold against my palm. Summer sun beat hard against the brick exterior of the building. I slid the key into my pocket and walked back to the workbench. Every single day followed the exact same pattern without variation. Eunice sat across the room with her ledger and her black coffee. She never looked up when the heavy service bay doors opened for a fresh customer. I spent my afternoons tightening bolts and listening to the steady hum of the compressor. The quiet discipline of keeping accurate records became my private habit over those long and grueling stretches of shop time. Another winter arrived with freezing winds rattling the glass panes. I added 3 more manila folders to the bottom drawer. Each folder contained carbon copies of every single repair ticket from the shop floor. The stack grew taller month by month without any outside help. Arlo walked by with a grease gun in his hand. He looked down at his boots and kept his mouth shut tight. He understood how things worked around here. Nobody in this building ever asked foolish questions about the strange numbers written in neat ink on the front desk. Spring brought heavy rainstorms that tested the roof seals. Water dripped near the corner where the spare tires rested. I fixed the leak using a patch of thick rubber and roofing tar. My hands stayed stained with old engine oil and dark grease. The shop continued its daily rhythm without interruption or complaint. Eunice turned another crisp page in her ledger with absolute confidence. I filed away 42 separate parts receipts behind a fresh cardboard divider. The heavy metal filing cabinet quietly held nearly 3 full years of silent proof regarding every single daily transaction. Time moved forward without mercy or pause. I replaced worn brake pads on hundreds of cars that rolled into Muncie. Each job generated a duplicate ticket that went straight into my private drawer. The pile of paper weighed heavy against the steel bottom. Eunice drank her coffee and ordered more supplies from the catalog. She never once noticed the growing mountain of duplicate paper records accumulating directly behind her completely unsuspecting back. My methods remained completely invisible to everyone else in the building. Another autumn painted the maple trees outside in shades of red and brown. Frost coated the metal tracks of the garage door every morning. I turned the small brass key in the lock and listened to the satisfying click. The bottom drawer contained everything required for the future. Every single calendar date was meticulously accounted for down to the very last-minute mechanical shop detail. The accumulated proof waited patiently in the dark enclosure. I closed the drawer and went back to work. Years slipped past like water flowing through a rusty pipe. The garage floor remained cold and unforgiving under my heavy work boots. I checked the alignment of a front suspension system with steady hands. Eunice adjusted her silver rings while checking the weekly deposit totals. We shared the same roof but lived in entirely different worlds. My system required no noise and no conflict. The accumulated paper records spoke entirely for themselves, without ever needing a single angry or loudly raised voice. Silence filled the space between our desks. I wiped my hands on a fresh blue towel. The metallic click of the lock echoed softly in the quiet room. Every single piece of evidence stayed secured in the dark metal. Time kept moving forward toward an inevitable reckoning that neither of us could stop or review. The office door stayed cracked open during the Tuesday shift. A cold draft swept across the linoleum floor. Eunice sat at her desk with a heavy leather ledger. She looked genuinely exhausted in the gray afternoon light while tracing the endless rows of figures with her silver rings. Her shoulders slumped against the back of the wooden chair. She pressed 2 fingers against her eyes. A quiet sound escaped her throat, something like a sigh of pure frustration. I paused by the wash basin with my blue rag. The strain of keeping the accounts straight was wearing her down too. Nobody could carry that kind of deception without paying a heavy personal price. She reached into her cardigan pocket for a peppermint. Her hands shook slightly before she managed to unwrap the small piece of candy. It was a remarkably ordinary gesture for someone who spent her life constructing elaborate financial walls. For a brief second, she looked less like an adversary and simply like a tired older sister. "Some people just don't have the head for business, Mabel, but I've always been glad to lend a hand," she said. The words dropped into the quiet space between the desks. She talked with her eyes fixed on the document. The phrasing was identical to the excuse she used on the very first day. Only now, the sheer repetition made the sentence sound brittle and strained. I rinsed my hands in the basin water. The drain made a hollow gurgling sound in the corner. $14,000 sat locked in the bottom drawer of the green filing cabinet across the room. Every single receipt confirmed the gap between her neat ledger and the actual cash flow. She cleared her throat and adjusted her reading glasses. The facade of complete dominance began fracturing along its margins. She checked a column 3 times before finding an error she had previously missed. Her pencil hovered over the page without making a mark. Arlo walked past the office window with a fresh broom. He did not look inside or offer a single word of commentary. He knew the numbers did not match any better than I did. The entire family structure was leaning too heavily on a foundation built of paper-thin lies. I dried my hands on a clean section of my rag. The quietness within the compact space carried an unfamiliar quality compared to past times. It was no longer just distance. It was the quiet weight of an approaching reckoning. Every single transaction recorded in my drawer told the true story. She closed the ledger with a dull thud. The leather cover showed deep scuffs along the spine from years of hurried use. She looked around the empty office as if searching for something she had misplaced long ago. Nothing in the room offered any real comfort to her. We both knew the books would eventually demand a proper accounting. The monthly invoices from the parts supplier made sure of that simple reality. No amount of careful handwriting could alter the physical inventory missing from the shelves. The discrepancies were simply too large to hide forever. She stood up from her chair and walked toward the small window. The glass reflected the darkening streetlights outside in Muncie. She placed one hand against the cold pane and stared into the street. The lie was becoming too heavy for even her to carry without stumbling. I walked back toward the engine stand to finish the cylinder head. The torque wrench rested on the metal tray beside a socket set. $14,000 waited quietly in the dark drawer of the cabinet. The system was reaching the exact limit of its endurance N. Before the reckoning, I want one honest answer from you. Do you think a quiet and careful record, can weigh more than the loudest voice in the room? I came to believe that it can. Tell me if you agree in the comments. And then stay with me, because what I kept is about to be the only thing that matters. The office door swung open. Eunice walked inside. She dropped a thick white envelope squarely on top of the green ledger while the rain tapped against the glass window pane. This paper settles every single question about $14,000, she said. I stayed seated by the work table. My fingers rested on a clean wrench. She pushed the signed statement closer to my coffee cup with her silver-ringed hand. Some people just don't have the head for business, Mabel, but I've always been glad to lend a hand, she said. Her voice carried that familiar tone of administrative charity. I reached out very slowly. The document bore her official signature at the bottom corner. It listed every single transaction from the prior quarter with forged vendor names. She had written out the entire false explanation in her own neat cursive script. That written overreach sat there under the fluorescent light shining down from the ceiling. I opened the bottom drawer of the green cabinet. I pulled out my own carbon copies from beneath the brake parts catalogs. These figures do not match the bank deposits at all, I said. She laughed softly. You never understood how accounts work in the real world, she said. I did not look away from the ink on the page. She had signed her name above a fraudulent inventory claim that legally bound her to the missing funds. The paper contained explicit proof of every unauthorized transfer made across the last 3 years. She leaned against the wooden desk with complete confidence. The silence in the small room felt remarkably thin before I spoke again. You signed this confession yourself, I said. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She stared at the paper in my hand with sudden confusion. I kept my breathing steady and quiet. The repair tickets matched the carbon copies perfectly in every detail. She had rushed her paperwork to secure a bank loan. That rush created a permanent paper trail that no family rule could ever erase. Every single line of her handwriting pointed directly to the missing cash drawer totals. I slid the document back into its envelope. She reached out to grab it from the desk. I pulled it away before her fingers could touch the flap. We are done arguing about numbers now, I said. She backed away toward the doorway without another whoa. The community hall filled with folding chairs for the local anniversary celebration today. I carried 3 heavy cardboard boxes through the double doors. Several local merchants adjusted their jackets nervously while waiting for the morning speeches to begin on the raised wooden stage. Eunice sat near the front table. She wore her silver rings and adjusted a heavy microphone stand. She expected speeches about family legacy today while smiling warmly at every person walking past. Arlo shuffled toward me near the back row. He stopped beside my stack of boxes. He held a battered cardboard folder under his stained canvas jacket while looking down at the polished floorboards. I looked down at the old pages. I appreciate this, I said quietly. He just placed the folder right on top of my boxes without waiting for any formal permission from the assembled crowd. The legacy artifact rested inside the top folder. It was the child drawing of a red truck held by a chipped magnet for years. I set it carefully on the wood surface so everyone in the room could see the faded crayon marks clearly. Eunice looked back from the podium. Her expression tightened slightly when she saw my boxes. She cleared her throat nervously while the local hardware store owner stared directly at the open cardboard storage containers. The air smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Dust motes drifted through shafts of afternoon sunlight cutting across the room. I unlatched the first metal clasp on the primary storage container very slowly. Decades of repair tickets filled the interior space. Every carbon copy and parts invoice remained arranged in strict chronological order. I knew the exact weight of those accumulated records from 3 difficult years. Arlo shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His boots scraped softly against the polished linoleum floor. I am just returning what properly belongs in the office files, he said quietly before stepping back toward the exit. He did not attempt to rescue me from anything. He simply corrected a small omission from his own past history. That was enough for any honest mechanic working in this small town. Eunice tapped the microphone with a polished fingernail. The sound echoed harshly through the metal speakers mounted near the ceiling. She began her prepared remarks about community stewardship and traditional family sacrifice loudly. I listened to her smooth voice float across the rows of empty chairs. The words sounded hollow against the stacked boxes. Every rattle has a cause, and the cause is always cheaper to face early, I thought quietly. The documentation weighed $14,000 in uncounted discrepancies alone, plus 3 years of fabricated inventory claims written in her own cursive script. The written proof sat waiting under the bright fluorescent lights. People started turning their heads to look at my corner of the hall. The silence grew heavy between the rows of empty folding seats. Eunice stopped speaking mid-sentence when she finally recognized the familiar green filing labels. Her silver rings flashed under the overhead bulbs. She lowered her notes onto the wooden podium ledge with trembling fingers. I did not raise my voice above a normal conversational tone inside the room. "We are going to review the actual shop ledger pages right now," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Eunice stepped away from the microphone. She wiped her palms on her dark wool skirt. The crowd shifted uneasily in the rows of metal folding chairs. Arlo stood near the side exit with his hands stuffed deep inside his canvas pockets. He gave me a short nod that settled the entire room much better than any angry shouting match could ever manage. I lifted the heavy lid of the primary cardboard container. $14,000 of missing shop revenue rested inside those orderly carbon copies. Every single parts invoice and service record told the exact same documented story of steady theft over 3 long years. Eunice walked down the wooden steps from the elevated stage. She stopped 3 feet away from my stacked boxes and crossed her arms tightly. "You have no right to display these private papers here," she said through clenched teeth. I pulled out the signed confession she handed me yesterday afternoon. The ink had dried completely under the office fluorescent lights. The faded crayon drawing sat right beside it under the bright hall lamps, reminding everyone of what our late father actually built. I placed her own written statement right on top of the old repair tickets. The hardware store owner leaned forward in his metal seat, squinting down at the child drawing with sudden deep confusion. Eunice stared at the paper with wide eyes. Her silver rings caught the afternoon glare coming through the high gymnasium windows. "We can talk about this in private," she whispered quietly. "We will talk about it right here in the open," I said. "The audit is finished and the numbers are completely transparent." Arlo turned around and walked out the double doors without looking back. He had done his part to set the record straight. The community quietly watched the accumulated paperwork tell the exact truth at last, without needing any further explanation from anyone. Every page in the box represented a specific mechanical repair. I knew every brake job and transmission teardown by heart. The local merchants whispered nervously near the back tables while they finally recognized the handwriting across the open ledger sheets. Eunice kept her gaze fixed on the polished linoleum floorboards. Nobody moved toward the stage. The heavy silence stretched completely across the gymnasium walls while I slowly turned yet another verified page in the black binder. The columns matched every bank deposit slip down to the last cent. Eunice reached out a shaking hand toward the podium edge. She looked much smaller under the harsh overhead lighting. I did not ever need to raise my voice. The record spoke with absolute clarity. Her silver rings clicked softly against the polished wooden podium as she finally dropped her tired arms entirely to her sides. I closed the cardboard storage lid with a quiet snap. The reckoning arrived without any dramatics. This particular final accounting arrived quietly through basic mathematics and careful daily filing instead of any loud public confrontation in the hall. Arlo waited outside by his truck. He watched the front doors swing open. The honest work was finally done. The morning autumn air felt cool against my face as I stepped past the quiet front row of chairs. I slowly picked up my heavy storage boxes and walked toward the bright exit doors without looking back once. The garage door stood wide to the gray morning air. A cold draft swept across the grease-stained concrete floor. I walked to the green cabinet near the time clock. The brass key turned easily in the worn lock. 4 manila folders rested inside the bottom metal drawer. They held 3 years of careful notes and duplicate receipts. I could have taken those folders straight to the courthouse downtown. That path would have stripped Eunice of everything she owned. As a working mechanic, I chose not to eliminate her since lugging that bulky paperwork around all day long proved far too tiring. Arlo wiped his hands on a blue rag near the alignment rack. He watched me from beneath the brim of his canvas cap. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Nothing happens," I said. The audit stayed in the drawer where it belonged. Most people in Muncie expected a massive public explosion after all those long months of quiet tracking behind the scenes. They wanted a public shouting match in the center of town. I had no appetite for courtroom drama or ruined family names. Letting go required less energy than holding onto a bitter grudge for years. I preferred the steady rhythm of fixing brakes and tuning carburetors over endless fights. Eunice stayed away from the shop for 3 straight days. Her desk in the front office remained empty and dark. Nobody answered the telephone when the insurance company called at noon. The business ledger sat untouched beside the adding machine. I walked past the glass partition and looked at the dust motes. No triumphant speech echoed off the concrete walls of the building. I did not demand an apology or a public confession from her. Opting for true professional restraint required pacing slowly away from the administration office while holding all the cards in the deck. I slid the brass key into my pocket and walked back to the bays. A rusted pickup truck rolled into the third bay around 2 o'clock. The engine made a sharp knocking sound near the intake manifold. I picked up my clipboard and reached for a half-inch socket wrench. Every single mechanical rattle in that old building had a distinct cause waiting patiently for a pair of working hands. That simple truth kept my mind anchored to the work in front of me. Eunice could keep whatever she had managed to scrape together over the years. I refused to spend my remaining decades acting as her unpaid jailer. Letting her keep her fragile illusion was the only practical choice left. Arlo adjusted a floor jack and nodded toward the broken valve cover. We went back to work without another word about the past. The afternoon sun cut long yellow bars across the wooden workbench. Tiny particles of dirt floated lazily across the beam of sunshine beside the glass. My father would never understand why I let the matter drop completely. My father always firmly believed that certain heavy business debts could simply not be collected without breaking the working machine. I left the manila folders locked safely inside the dark green steel housing. Letting go felt strange after guarding those incriminating carbon copies for so long. The temptation to exact full retribution faded away into the afternoon shadows. Peace arrived quietly when I stopped caring about what she deserved. Arlo handed me a steel gasket scraper from the top of his toolbox. His weathered fingers were permanently stained with dark engine oil and carbon. We both knew the books were still crooked in the front office. Neither of us cared enough to cross the showroom floor once more. I finally realized that some bitter garage battles were simply not worth winning if they cost you your daily peace. I wiped my forehead with the back of my dusty work shirt. The shop hummed with the familiar sound of an air compressor restarting out sea. The shop floor smelled of clean oil. I picked up a heavy socket. Arlo carried the new inventory boxes across the concrete floor without complaining once about his tired old back and joints. He placed them down with care. That small shift in his daily habits mattered more than any apology could have managed. Words were never his strong suit anyway. He just kept working. I walked over to the institutional green filing cabinet near the time clock. The metal surface felt cool beneath my palm. A child drawing of a red truck remained held in place by a chipped magnet. The edges of the paper had curled upward over the long winters. I traced the faded crayon line with my thumb. It was the only piece of genuine history left in the room. Eunice had taken her leather portfolio, but this small marker stayed behind where it belonged. Arlo walked past with a fresh broom in his hand. He stopped by the cabinet and looked at the red truck drawing for a long moment. He did not say anything about the past weeks. He simply reached out and tapped the chipped magnet straight with his knuckle. The gesture was quiet and deliberate. It was his way of acknowledging the change in the shop without making a speech. I nodded back to him. We had years of routine ahead of us in this garage. The bays were open to whatever vehicles came down the state road next. Every single repair ticket would get logged properly in the fresh book on the desk. No extra columns would ever be hidden away in the dark. The accounts balanced themselves when honest labor ran the room. I set my socket wrench down on the steel workbench. The metal made a sharp clink against the surface. Outside the frosted windows, the afternoon traffic moved steadily through Muncie. There was nothing more to prove to anyone. I picked up a gasket scraper and went back to work on the cylinder head. The engine block needed a clean seal before the customer returned to pick up the said. You know how it goes when something small starts tapping against the engine block. Arlo was sweeping the far bay with long, slow strokes of his broom across the concrete. You can choose to ignore the noise, or you can open the hood before the whole thing completely seizes up on the open highway. I left the shop keys hanging right there by the time clock on their worn brass ring. Every single knock in the machinery has a hidden root, and waiting only multiplies the final damage. I pulled my heavy canvas jacket tight against the sharp evening chill. The metal door groaned slightly as I guided it down along the grease-stained tracks. You are the one who decides when to stop listening to the persistent rattle and finally walk away into the quiet night air. I stepped out into the gravel lot, listening to the steady crunch of my boots against the frozen ground. The heavy steel lock clicked shut behind me without a single backward glance.